I remember the exact sound my phone made that night. That small vibration that usually meant nothing. It was the kind of sound you hear every day and never think twice about. But that night, it carried something different. Something that would change everything. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a crash or an alarm or a warning bell. It was quiet. Too quiet. Maybe that's why I opened it. Maybe that's why curiosity took over when logic should have stopped me. I picked up my phone, unlocked it, and there it was. A single message waiting for me. Just a photo, no words, no explanation. But that one image said everything I didn't want to hear. I stared at it, my heart pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. It was them, the two people I trusted most. The two people who weren't supposed to be standing next to each other like that. He was there, smiling, with that familiar half grin that always made me weak. And beside him, my best friend, her arm around him. Their faces lit up with joy. My world went silent. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, phone in hand, staring at that picture, as if it would change if I blinked enough times. I zoomed in. I looked again and again, hoping I was wrong, hoping there was some explanation I couldn't see. But no matter how many times I tried to rewrite the story, the truth stood still. It was real. They were together, laughing, comfortable, like I had never existed. Everything started making sense in reverse. The unanswered messages, the excuses, the plans she suddenly forgot, the way his attention had started to drift whenever I talked. The small changes I noticed but ignored because I didn't want to seem paranoid. I remembered all the times she'd smiled at me and said, "You know I'd never do that to you." And I believed her, because that's what best friends do. They trust. But betrayal doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It slips in quietly, disguised as normal moments. The night she told me she was too tired to hang out, maybe she was with him. The afternoon he said he was busy. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe I was just the one who didn't fit anymore. Anger didn't come right away. It crept in slowly, like frost spreading over glass. Cold, clear, quiet. There were no screams, no tears, not yet. Just this chilling realization that everything I had believed about them, about us, had been rewritten without my permission. She had been my person, the one I trusted with my secrets, my insecurities, my heart. I had told her about my feelings for him. She had listened, smiled, and promised me she would never cross that line. And she didn't just cross it, she danced over it, laughing. I felt something inside me shift that night. It was like the world had tilted slightly off its axis, and I was the only one who noticed. My thoughts were sharp, my emotions raw, but beneath it all was something even stronger, clarity. I saw everything for what it was. Every small lie, every half-truth, every fake smile. I started to realize that betrayal doesn't always look like war. Sometimes it looks like two people laughing in a picture. Part of me wanted to call her right then and there, to demand answers, to ask why, to tell her she'd broken something she could never fix. But then another part of me, the quieter, colder part, told me not to. She expected me to react. She expected tears, accusations, drama. She wanted to be able to tell people later how I'd lost control, how I'd made a scene, how she was the victim of my jealousy. I wasn't going to give her that story. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark. I let the silence fill the room. My breathing slowed. My thoughts stopped spinning. And in that silence, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for people who had already chosen to betray me. I wasn't going to chase anyone who had walked away willingly. If she thought she'd get to watch me crumble, she was wrong. Revenge crossed my mind, but not the loud kind. Not the dramatic, destructive kind that leaves ashes behind. No, what I wanted was quieter, smarter, precise. The kind that doesn't need shouting to be felt. The kind that lets time do the talking. I didn't want to ruin her life. I wanted her to see herself clearly, to see what she had become, to watch her realize that the foundation she'd built her happiness on was hollow. That night, I started paying attention. I watched her patterns, the things she thought I wouldn't notice, the messages she hid, the excuses she made, the sudden guilt in her voice when she mentioned his name. She thought she was being clever, but guilt has a way of leaking through even the best smiles. Every time I saw her, I pretended nothing had changed. I listened, I nodded, I let her talk. But inside, I was studying her like a map, waiting for her to take one wrong step too far. I wasn't going to destroy her. I was going to let her destroy herself. People who lie always do. Eventually, she had always believed I was predictable. The loyal friend, the forgiving one, the person who would always take her back no matter what. And maybe that used to be true, but not anymore. That night, something in me hardened. I realized that forgiveness without consequences isn't kindness. It's permission. And I wasn't giving her permission to keep breaking me. I looked at the photo one last time before deleting it. I didn't need the proof anymore. I didn't need to hold on to the pain. The truth was enough. I knew what she'd done, and that was all I needed. From that point on, my silence would speak louder than anything I could ever say. People think revenge means hurting the other person, but that's not always true. Sometimes the best revenge is letting someone lose access to you completely, letting them feel the absence they never thought would exist, letting them face the quiet weight of their own actions. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would rise above this. I would not beg. I would not cry for anyone who chose to betray me. I would rebuild quietly, piece by piece. And as I did, she would watch the same thing happen over and over. Her lies catching up to her. Her smiles fading. Her confidence cracking. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to wait, because the truth always surfaces. And when it did, she'd finally see what she'd done. And that, I knew, would hurt far more than anything I could ever say. When people imagine revenge, they think of chaos. Doors slamming, voices raised, scenes so loud that everyone stops to watch. For a brief moment, I wanted that too. I wanted to throw everything she had given me back in her face, to burn every bridge and walk away with the fire behind me. But rage burns out too quickly. It gives you a spark and leaves you standing in the dark, alone, wondering what you've really won. I didn't want that kind of hollow satisfaction. I wanted something deeper, something that would last longer than noise. So I made a decision. My revenge would be quiet, not a performance, but a plan, a slow, deliberate reconstruction of myself, until she couldn't recognize the person she once believed she could use. The first step was simple, almost invisible. I stopped reaching out first. It's strange how much power hides inside silence. For years, I had been the one who texted good morning, who checked in, who rearranged my plans to fit hers. I was dependable, predictable, the person who could be counted on to show up even when she didn't deserve it. But I began to unlearn that. The next time she went quiet for days, I didn't chase her with a, "Are you okay?" or "Did I do something wrong?" I let the silence stretch, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And in that space, something shifted. I started to feel the weight of my own worth again. I wasn't disappearing. I was reclaiming ground she'd casually walked across for years. At first, she didn't notice. People like her never do. She assumed I was just busy, or moody, or waiting for her call like always. But I didn't bend this time. When she finally texted, I didn't rush to reply. I waited. When she asked to meet, I checked my schedule and said, "I can't tonight, maybe another day." It wasn't revenge yet. It was recovery. Each small no stitched another part of me back together. Every time I chose silence over explanation, I could feel her losing the version of me she depended on. The forgiving, available, ever-patient friend who made her selfishness comfortable. While I withdrew from her, I turned toward myself. The things I had abandoned in the name of friendship. My writing, my hobbies, my small daily rituals. I brought them back to life. I began waking up earlier, sitting with my coffee and my journal, pouring thoughts onto paper that I had once only shared with her. I read again, took long walks without checking my phone, and started spending time with people who asked how I was because they cared, not because they were curious. My world, once orbiting around her approval, began expanding again, and it felt good, not in a triumphant way, but in a peaceful, grounded one. I didn't have to prove I was fine. I just had to be fine, but I wasn't naive. I knew she'd notice eventually. People like her always sense when their grip loosens, so I prepared for that too. I began observing instead of reacting. When she posted photos with him, I didn't comment or like. When she brought up his name, testing my reaction, I smiled faintly and changed the subject. My calmness confused her. I could see it in her eyes. She was waiting for a crack, a burst of emotion that would prove she still mattered. But I had learned something powerful. Indifference unsettles a manipulator more than anger ever could. She wanted me loud. I gave her silence. She wanted to see pain. I showed her composure. It was the most unsettling revenge I could have chosen. Behind the calm, I was documenting everything. Not because I wanted ammunition, but because truth fades when emotion clouds your memory. I kept screenshots, notes, and small details. The dates of cancelled plans. The excuses that didn't match. The time she had twisted facts to her favor. Each note became a line in the quiet story I was writing. Not for the world, but for myself. I wanted to make sure that if I ever doubted what had happened, I could look back and remember. I wasn't crazy, and I hadn't imagined the betrayal. There were nights I questioned myself. Patience doesn't feel heroic when you're in the middle of it. Sometimes I'd lie awake and wonder if I was just being weak by not confronting her outright. It would have been so easy to expose her, to tell everyone the truth, to make her squirm under the weight of her own actions. But I didn't. I reminded myself that confrontation gives attention. And attention was the last thing I wanted to give her. Letting her think she still had control, while I slowly dismantled every connection between us. That was the real game. As time passed, I started noticing small changes in her behavior. She'd text me more often now, suddenly missing me, wanting to meet up. When I did see her, she'd ask carefully worded questions about my life, about who I'd been spending time with. She was trying to read a story she was no longer a character in. That amused me more than I expected. I answered her questions politely, vaguely, giving her nothing to hold on to. The less she knew, the more restless she became. That restlessness was my quiet victory. Meanwhile, I invested my energy elsewhere. I joined a writing group, made new friends, laughed more freely. I realized how small my world had become when it revolved around someone who saw me as a backup. Now, every step I took away from her brought new air into my lungs. I didn't need to win against her anymore. I just needed to live well enough that her betrayal looked meaningless in comparison. My revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about replacement, replacing pain with growth, dependence with independence, betrayal with clarity. Still, there was a part of me that wanted her to see. Not to suffer, but to recognize what she'd lost. So I began to plant small, deliberate moments of truth. A comment here, a story shared there. Always honest, never cruel. I let mutual friends see that I was thriving, not broken. I didn't badmouth her. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of traveling quietly, but efficiently. It reaches the right ears when spoken with calm sincerity. Slowly, her image began to crack. People started asking questions she didn't want to answer. that was when I knew the plan was working. Not because I'd orchestrated a downfall, but because I'd outgrown the part of me that needed to prove anything. By the time she finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The version of me she had betrayed no longer existed. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. She had become a lesson, not a loss. And my revenge? It wasn't about destruction. It was about reconstruction of my peace, my pride, my boundaries. I didn't destroy her life. I simply stopped letting her live in mine. And in that silence, in that unshakable calm, I found something far more satisfying than any outburst could have given me. I found myself again. The first domino didn't fall with a dramatic crash or a grand reveal. It was quieter than that, almost graceful in its simplicity. It was the night of the party, the one she had sworn would be our night. We had planned to go together, the way we always used to, showing up as a pair that people could count on. But this time, I didn't follow the script. I went alone, not as an act of rebellion, but as a declaration. I wasn't her shadow anymore. Getting ready felt like a ceremony. I stood in front of my mirror, brushing my hair, choosing an outfit that made me feel sharp, composed, untouchable, not beautiful for her approval, not impressive for anyone else, but right for me. My heartbeat was steady as I added the final touch, confidence. That had been missing for months, stolen bit by bit by someone I had called my best friend. Tonight, I was taking it back. When I entered the party, I expected the usual curious glances, the polite smiles, the kind of half-hearted attention people give when they're waiting for someone more interesting to arrive. But something different happened. Heads turned. Not dramatically, not like in a movie, but enough to make me notice. People who hadn't spoken to me in weeks came up, smiling, talking, genuinely wanting to engage. The room that once felt like a stage she owned suddenly became neutral ground. And for the first time, I wasn't performing. I was present. I laughed. Not to fill silence or to please anyone, but because something inside me had finally loosened. It wasn't forced joy. It was release. Each conversation reminded me of the person I had been before she started rewriting me and her story. Confident, kind, self-assured. That person had never disappeared. She'd just been waiting for space to breathe. I didn't look for her, but I felt the moment she arrived. The shift in the room was subtle. A murmur, a change in rhythm. I turned my head slightly and saw her walk in, perfectly styled. With that smile she wore like armor. She had always entered rooms like she owned them. For a second, I almost admired her for it. Then her eyes met mine, and I saw it. That flicker of confusion. The split second, where she realized I wasn't waiting for her anymore. She came closer, her laughter loud enough to demand attention, her presence magnetic in the way it had always been. But this time, I didn't move toward her. I stayed rooted, calm, surrounded by people who were genuinely happy to see me. When she reached our circle, the energy changed. Normally, she would have been the center, the one steering the conversation. But the group's attention didn't shift this time. It stayed with me, not because I demanded it, but because I was finally comfortable in my own space. She tried to joke. The kind of teasing she used to get away with when I'd laugh it off, just to keep the peace. I smiled politely, but didn't play along. My silence was soft but deliberate. She noticed. Everyone noticed. It wasn't confrontation. It was correction. She had spent so long expecting me to make her comfortable that my neutrality unsettled her more than anger ever could. That night, I realized something important. Betrayal survives because of permission. Every time I'd forgiven her without question, every time I'd excused her selfishness, I'd handed her another ticket to continue. But not anymore. The power wasn't in punishing her. It was in removing her sense of control. I didn't need to insult her or draw attention to what she'd done. The absence of the old me, the forgiving, dependent version. Was punishment enough? I could see the cracks forming as the night went on. Her laughter grew sharper, less genuine. She adjusted her dress, her hair, her tone. Small signs of discomfort she tried to hide. She was used to being adored, but that night she had to compete for something she thought was guaranteed. Watching her realize that was strangely satisfying, not because I wanted her to hurt, but because it meant she was finally seeing what I had seen all along. Her control was an illusion. When I finally decided to leave, she followed me outside, pretending it was coincidence. "You didn't tell me you'd come alone," she said, her voice soft, almost rehearsed. I smiled and replied, "I didn't think it mattered." Her face tightened for a second before she smoothed it over with a laugh. She tried to suggest we should hang out soon, the way we used to, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. For the first time, she wasn't sure if I'd say yes. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A message from her. "You looked great tonight. Missed you." Simple words, but I could feel the shift underneath them. That wasn't kindness. It was strategy. She wanted reassurance that I was still there, still orbiting. I waited an hour before replying. "Thanks. Hope you had fun." Polite, controlled. A perfect mirror of indifference. She responded again. Something casual, something meaningless. I didn't reply. And that was when I knew the first domino had fallen. Not in chaos, but in control. The next day, I noticed the ripple. Friends who had always grouped us together now messaged me separately. Conversations that used to begin with "you two" shifted to "you." People started seeing us as individuals. And in that separation, I found power. She, on the other hand, began to fumble. Small, nervous texts. Questions wrapped in casual phrasing. "Everything okay between us? You seem distant lately." I read them all with a kind of detached curiosity. She wasn't reaching out because she cared. She was reaching out because she was losing grip. I gave her short replies. Enough to be civil, never enough to give her what she wanted. Every time I withheld the warmth she used to take for granted, I could feel the dynamic shift a little more. That was the beauty of the first domino. It wasn't destruction. It was clarity. She had built her comfort on my compliance, her confidence on my silence. Once I stepped out of that role, her foundation started to tremble. People saw her differently, not because I exposed her, but because she exposed herself, trying to keep up an illusion that no longer had support. I walked away from that night changed. There was no loud victory, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet knowledge that I had reclaimed my narrative. She had once defined me by what she could take. Now, I was defining myself by what I refused to give. The first domino fell, not because I pushed it, but because I stopped holding it up. And from that single quiet moment of control, everything else began to shift in my favor. I never believed in gossip. Not the petty, venomous kind that twists words and ruins reputations. But I did learn that sometimes silence only protects the wrong person. There's a difference between revenge and revelation. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to breathe on its own, no longer suffocated by her charm or my silence. That's when I began what I came to call my whisper campaign. It started subtly. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet, deliberate truth-telling. Measured, clean, without poison. I spoke to people we both knew, not to vent or to recruit allies, but to plant seeds of awareness. She's been unreliable lately, I'd mention in passing, or it's strange how she says one thing and does another. Simple statements, said lightly. I didn't accuse, I observed. People don't argue with calmness, they question it. At first, it felt uncomfortable. For so long, I had been trained, by her and by habit, to protect her image, even at my own expense. I used to excuse her lateness, defend her sharp comments, and soften her betrayals with humor. But this time, I refused to cushion the truth. The first time I told someone, she said she'd be there but cancelled last minute again. I expected guilt to follow. It didn't. Instead, I felt a small satisfying click. Like the sound of the next domino tipping over. People listened differently when I stopped performing. They didn't rush to defend her like before. Some nodded slowly, connecting dots they hadn't realized were part of the same pattern. One friend frowned and said, "Now that you mention it, she's done that to me too." Another admitted they had started to feel uneasy around her, but couldn't put it into words until now. It wasn't about gossip. It was about recognition. When truth meets readiness, it spreads naturally. I kept my tone steady, factual, detached. I never exaggerated, never labeled her cruel or manipulative. Instead, I said things like, "She tends to prioritize what benefits her most," or "She's charming." But sometimes that charm hides a lack of follow-through. These weren't attacks. They were reflections. And reflections, when repeated in the right light, become mirrors people can't avoid looking into. Slowly, I began to see the shift. People around her, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, started noticing what I had noticed for months. They paid attention to her small contradictions, the promises that evaporated, the insincere apologies followed by the same behavior. The beauty of quiet truth is that once it's out there, it doesn't need to be repeated. It echoes on its own. She began to sense it. At first, she couldn't understand why conversations felt slightly colder, or why certain people no longer rushed to validate her every word. She tried harder to charm them, but charm is a limited currency when overused. People started to hesitate before believing her. When she told stories about me, because of course she did, they listened, but not with the blind loyalty she was used to. They looked at her differently now, measuring her words instead of absorbing them. Then came the self-inflicted unraveling. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more she revealed. She would over-explain, over-defend, talk too much. "It's all a misunderstanding," she'd insist, adding unnecessary details that didn't align with her past words. Every attempt to protect her image created small cracks. People who once saw her as composed began to see desperation. That's the thing about deception. It needs consistency, and the truth quietly dismantles that consistency piece by piece. At work, subtle changes appeared. People who had once invited her to lead or speak began including others instead. Small gatherings that used to orbit around her started shifting their centers. Invitations came directly to me instead of passing through her. It wasn't isolation, it was redistribution. The balance was being restored without anyone needing to name it, she noticed. I could see it in the way she watched me from across the room, trying to gauge if I had said something, done something. But I never did anything obvious. My revenge wasn't loud, it was patient. I didn't need to make her look bad. I just needed her actions to be visible without my silence hiding them. Truth, when left alone long enough, becomes undeniable. She started to test the waters, reaching out to people with her usual charm, offering apologies wrapped in justifications. But the tone had shifted. Where there had once been admiration, there was now polite distance. People smiled, but their eyes didn't soften. She could feel it. That subtle yet suffocating loss of control. That's when she tried to reclaim the narrative, by reaching out to me. Her message was almost predictable. "I feel like people are misunderstanding me. I hope you haven't been saying anything that adds to it." I stared at the words for a long moment, then smiled. The irony of it was almost poetic. The same person who had manipulated perception for so long now feared perception itself. I replied simply, "I've only shared my experiences honestly. People make their own conclusions." That was all it took. No accusation, no denial, just truth. Sharp and clean enough to leave a mark. After that, I didn't need to say much more. The whisper campaign had done its work. It wasn't built on noise or lies. It was built on precision. The right truth, told at the right time, to the right people. I learned that revenge doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it's a whisper that travels faster than any scream. I watched her navigate the new version of her world, one where every interaction carried uncertainty. Every smile felt conditional. The spotlight she used to command so easily now flickered unpredictably. She was still visible, but not admired. And that's the most subtle form of justice. When someone who built their power on illusion must finally live within reality. For me, there was no triumphal moment, no celebration, just peace. The quiet satisfaction of knowing I had corrected the imbalance. I hadn't destroyed her reputation. I had simply stopped protecting it. The truth, once freed, didn't need my defense. It stood tall on its own, whispering through every room she entered, reminding her, and everyone else, that perception, once changed, rarely reverts. That day was the kind of quiet that sits heavy on your skin. The sun wasn't too bright, the wind barely moved, and everything seemed to exist in slow motion. I remember standing outside the cafe, staring at the door, knowing that once I walked through, nothing between us would ever be the same again. She had asked to meet, said she wanted to talk, to clear the air. I'd heard that phrase before, always from people who wanted to clean up their image, not their behavior. Still, I went, not for her, but for myself. I was done holding all that weight in silence. I wanted to look her in the eye and watch her face when she realized I no longer played her game. When she arrived, she looked exactly how I expected. Calm, polished. That soft half smile she wore when she wanted to look harmless. She always carried herself like someone who knew her words could bend the story. For a second, I wondered how many people had already fallen for that smile. I wasn't going to be one of them anymore. She sat down across from me, her voice smooth as ever, asking how I'd been, pretending like there wasn't a canyon between us. I let her talk. She spoke about misunderstandings and miscommunications, about how things had gotten blown out of proportion. She said it all like we were business partners, resolving a minor mistake, not best friends dealing with betrayal. When she finished her little speech, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for the usual, for me to say it's fine, to forgive, to make it easier for her to feel like a good person again. But I didn't. I reached into my bag and placed a small notebook on the table. She glanced at it, confused, until I said quietly, "This is what I wrote down, the moments that changed everything." Her eyes flickered between the notebook and my face, uncertain now. She laughed nervously, as if I were joking, but I didn't smile. I opened it and turned a few pages, reading out loud a few lines that were nothing more than dates and small, undeniable truths. "You said you were sick that night," I said softly, "but you went out with him instead. You told me you didn't know why I was distant, but you were already talking about me to others." I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I just stated the facts, and sometimes facts are louder than any scream. Her face tightened. "You're keeping notes on me?" she asked, the disbelief more about being caught than about being wrong. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, I'm keeping notes on what you did to me." She shifted in her seat, trying to laugh it off again, but her confidence cracked. She started talking quickly, explaining how things were complicated, how she hadn't meant for it to go so far, how she was under pressure, how everyone makes mistakes. The excuses poured out like water, trying to put out a fire already too deep to reach. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, leaning forward, as if proximity could make her lies sound sincere. Meaning, I thought, the word tasted bitter. People hide behind that word. They use it to clean their hands without ever touching the mess they made. "You didn't mean to hurt me," I said quietly. "But you did, over and over." I told her how I'd stayed up at night trying to defend her to myself, how I blamed my own instincts for doubting her, how I made excuses that cost me my peace and friendships. I told her how I covered for her lies because I thought loyalty meant silence. You didn't just take my trust, I said. You made me doubt my own perception of truth, she sighed, leaning back, rolling her eyes slightly. The same expression she used when she wanted to turn the situation into something dramatic, something she could later call an overreaction. You're making this so complicated, she said. I will never forget that moment. Those words snapped something inside me, because to her, my pain was complicated. My heartbreak, my confusion, my sleepless nights, all of it was just an inconvenience to her clean version of events. For her, it was just a mistake. For me, it was the slow destruction of something sacred. I looked at her for a long moment before saying, I'm not making it complicated. I'm making it clear. She looked startled, like she didn't expect me to push back. She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. For once, I didn't shrink. I told her everything I had never said. How she had made me feel invisible in rooms I helped her build. How she had used my loyalty as a tool. How she had betrayed me, and then expected me to be grateful for the attention she still offered. My voice didn't shake. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. When I was done, I pushed the notebook toward her. You don't have to apologize again, I said. Just read it, see it, understand that this happened, and it mattered. She didn't move. Her hands stayed folded on the table, her mouth slightly open, as if she had words, but no idea which ones could still save her. For the first time, I saw the truth settle in her eyes. Not guilt, not sorrow, just realization. She couldn't control this moment. She couldn't twist it into something small or manageable. I had taken that power away. We left separately. No hugs, no empty promises to talk soon, just silence. The rope that had tied us together for years, one I had clung to even when it burned, finally snapped. I felt it give way, not with pain, but with relief. I didn't cry. I didn't look back to see if she did. I just walked away, and the world felt lighter. Over the next few days, the shift became visible. People noticed. Mutual friends who used to ask if we were okay stopped pretending not to know. They'd seen enough. She tried to explain herself a few times. I heard. Short, frantic conversations where she said I'd overreacted, that it was more complicated than that. But people weren't buying it anymore. The cracks had become too obvious. Her confidence, her charm, the things that once made her untouchable, were slipping. And me, I didn't feel victorious. Just still, calm. It was done. That meeting had been the point of no return. The place where the story stopped being about what she did to me and became about what I chose next. And for the first time in a long time, I chose myself. I walked home that day, the air cool and heavy with something like peace. And I realized that revenge wasn't about making her hurt. It was about ending the part of me that still cared if she did. After that last conversation, everything shifted in a way I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't immediate, not a clean break or a sharp cut, more like the slow unwinding of something that had been too tightly bound for too long. She began to reach out again, in cautious, deliberate ways, as if trying to stitch together the frayed edges she herself had torn apart. There were messages at odd hours, each laced with apology and nostalgia. I miss our talks, she'd write, or I wish we could go back to how things were. The words looked sincere on the screen, but sincerity without transformation is just decoration. I had learned that lesson too deeply to be fooled again. She sent gifts once or twice. Things that used to hold meaning. A book we had once talked about. A scarf in my favorite color. Even a playlist with songs we had once shared. I didn't respond with anger or rejection. I thanked her politely and moved on. Her attempts felt less like genuine remorse and more like guilt searching for relief. True repair doesn't come from occasional gestures. It comes from showing up differently, consistently, day after day. And she couldn't do that. She wanted forgiveness without effort, peace without accountability. While she tried to smooth over the past, I began reclaiming my present. I poured energy into things I had set aside, projects, hobbies, friendships that had dimmed under her shadow. I rejoined the writing workshop I had quit because she said it took too much of my time. The first day back, I felt nervous, almost out of place, until I realized how much I had missed that environment. The creative chaos, the smell of coffee and paper, the way people spoke with genuine curiosity instead of veiled competition. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Revenge had stopped being about her long before she noticed. It wasn't about watching her lose or stumble. It was about proving to myself that she hadn't taken anything I couldn't rebuild. Living well became my rebellion. I started to laugh more, not the polite laugh that smooths over tension, but the real kind, spontaneous and freeing. I met new people who didn't know my history with her, who saw me without the baggage of what I had endured. They became mirrors that reflected back the parts of me I thought I'd lost. She noticed, of course. People like her always do. The silence between us grew louder as she tried to maintain control of the narrative. I could see it in her subtle comments, the way she'd mention my name in conversations to mutual friends, weaving in fragments of her own story to keep herself relevant. But the thread was breaking. People no longer listened with the same sympathy. They had started to notice the patterns I had endured quietly for so long. The small lies, the broken promises, the manipulative charm. Once awareness enters a room, it changes everything. Then came the moment that cemented the shift. It was small, almost ordinary. She had offered to help a colleague with a project, promising to take charge of an important part of it. The colleague, a friend of mine, trusted her word, but when the deadline came, she disappeared, leaving them scrambling to fix what she'd neglected. It was the kind of behavior I knew all too well, the same neglect she had once disguised as being overwhelmed or busy. Only this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was public. Everyone saw it. The aftermath was quiet but decisive. People started to distance themselves, not in open confrontation, but in subtle shifts. Unanswered messages, polite excuses, invitations that no longer included her. For years, she had manipulated her way through relationships using charm as currency, but that charm had expired. The reputation she had once curated began to dissolve under the weight of consistency, or rather, her lack of it. She had built her image on selective truths, and when the full story emerged, even her best lines couldn't cover the cracks. Watching it unfold brought no satisfaction, only clarity. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I didn't need to. What she was facing wasn't punishment. It was equilibrium. The universe has a quiet way of returning balance, where it's been disturbed. I had waited, not for vengeance, but for truth to stand on its own legs. And it did, one unremarkable day at a time. I ran into her a few weeks after that incident. It was at a mutual friends gathering, the kind of event we used to attend together, without tension. She looked different, still composed, still wearing that familiar confident expression, but something in her eyes betrayed the effort. When our gazes met, she smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her face. I smiled back, not out of politeness, but from a place of peace. That tiny exchange felt like closure, the kind that doesn't need words. She knew, I knew, there was nothing left to say. After that, she stopped reaching out altogether. The silence didn't sting. It soothed. I realized that the absence of chaos is its own kind of reward. I filled that space with better things. New projects, late-night laughter, mornings without dread. The friendships that had once been strained by her influence grew stronger. People who had doubted my side of the story now understood without me having to explain. That's the quiet justice of truth. It doesn't need to shout. It simply waits until it's undeniable. Looking back, I see that the real turning point wasn't her losing credibility or people seeing her for who she was. The turning point was me no longer needing to witness it. I didn't crave validation anymore. I didn't seek apologies. I didn't replay old conversations, trying to find the moment everything went wrong. The story had already ended. I was simply learning to live beyond its last sentence. The peace that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like a heartbeat I'd forgotten how to hear. I began to dream again, to make plans that didn't involve damage control. The energy I had once used to survive her became energy I used to create. That, more than anything, was the real revenge. Not her downfall, but my return. She had taken pieces of my trust, but she hadn't taken my capacity to rebuild. By the time months had passed, her name stopped coming up in conversation, not out of avoidance, out of irrelevance. And that's when I knew I had won, not against her, but for myself. I had stepped beyond the wreckage and built something she could no longer touch. The turning point wasn't a moment. It was a slow awakening to my own power. It was the quiet realization that I didn't need anyone to lose for me to rise. Her world didn't collapse all at once. Not in the fiery, dramatic way people imagine when they think of revenge or ruin. There were no shouting matches, no public humiliations, no sudden cataclysmic events. That wasn't what I wanted, and it wasn't what I set out to create. Cruelty is cheap, fleeting, and leaves the one who wields it just as empty as the one it targets. What I wanted was far subtler, far more permanent. I wanted her to awaken to the truth of the person she had chosen to be and to feel, deep down, the cost of that choice. The fall I orchestrated wasn't a collapse of her life or livelihood. It was the dismantling of an image she had spent years perfecting, an image that had always relied on selective charm, careful attention, and the unquestioning admiration of those around her. People had long praised her for her spontaneity, her laughter, the effortless way she drew people in. Her charm was a shield, a veil that masked inconsistency, self-interest, and small betrayals. For years it worked. People forgave little indiscretions, misread manipulation as humor, and overlooked the subtle ways she controlled attention. That veil began to lift slowly, imperceptibly at first. Compliments turned into uncomfortable silences, people's eyes flicking toward each other instead of her when she spoke. Invitations that had once been automatic became absent. She noticed this too, of course, but she misinterpreted it as temporary, as a phase or distraction. She didn't understand that consistency builds trust, and inconsistency reveals character. It began with small, almost imperceptible refusals. Friends who had once sought her company first began consulting others. Messages went unanswered. Plans were made without her. Small social cues indicated that her presence was no longer the gravitational center it had been. Each omission wasn't punishment. It was consequence. People simply started to live their lives with less reference to her, and the shift felt heavier than any argument could have made it. She began to feel the isolation slowly, like the subtle erosion of a riverbank. At first gentle, almost unnoticed, then undeniable. In parallel, she tried to control the narrative through appearances. Photos posted on social media depicted happiness, spontaneity, and charm. The perfect illusion of the life she wanted everyone to believe she lived. But the camera lies. Screens can't mask the subtle truths that come from real connections. Friends and allies, people who had watched, listened, and remembered, began to speak plain words about boundaries, accountability, and responsibility. In contrast, her curated posts rang hollow. What she tried to project was no longer reflected in the responses she received. Her applause had disappeared. replaced by polite restraint, indifference, or gentle questioning. The facade began to crack, not because of scandal or confrontation, but because truth is cumulative and patient. She made one last attempt to reclaim dignity publicly, crafting apologies that were polished and measured, framed like statements in a press release, rather than admissions of guilt. She reached out to people she had manipulated, hoping they would respond with the warmth and validation she was accustomed to. But the community that once celebrated her charm had already moved on. Responses were tepid at best, polite acknowledgments that failed to offer the affirmation she craved. The silence beneath those words cut deeper than any argument could have. It was the absence of echo she had relied on for so long. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable, and it carried a weight she had never anticipated. I observed all of this with conflicting emotions. There was relief, yes. The same relief one feels when a chronic wound finally gets air, when a long-buried truth is allowed to surface. But there was also sadness. This person had once been my closest confidant, someone I had trusted with secrets, laughter, and my most private moments. Seeing her reputation quietly erode wasn't satisfying in the way one might expect from revenge. It was poignant, a reminder of what was lost and what had been sacrificed in the process of betrayal. Husks fall away, sometimes leaving beauty, sometimes leaving emptiness, but always revealing the truth beneath. Her defenses weakened gradually. Small moments exposed her inconsistencies, her evasions, and the subtle manipulations she had relied upon. Mutual friends, now aware of the full scope of her behavior, began to interact with her differently. They didn't confront her aggressively. They didn't ostracize her. They simply adjusted, changing the dynamics she had counted on. The invitations she once expected went elsewhere. The spontaneous moments of connection she relied on dwindled. She was present, but irrelevant, still performing the role she had practiced for years, but without an audience willing to participate. The power of this quiet unraveling lies in its inevitability. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't require validation. It just persists until the person relying on illusions finds them inadequate. Her fall was composed of many small, invisible events, each one imperceptible in isolation, but cumulatively devastating. It was social, emotional, and psychological. A slow erosion that revealed the emptiness beneath her carefully constructed persona. There were moments when I caught glimpses of her uncertainty, a flicker in her eyes when she realized she could no longer manipulate the flow of conversation, a hesitation in her voice when she tried to charm others, now met with skepticism, a subtle tension in her posture when she noticed the absence of old friends, the lack of automatic attention she had grown dependent on. These moments were quiet, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know the story, but I saw them clearly. They were the proof that consequence doesn't always arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it arrives as perception, as awareness, as self-recognition. In the end, she was left with choices: to own her behavior and rebuild honestly, or to retreat further into manipulation and new corners where she might try to regain power. I hoped she would choose the former, though I knew the latter was possible. It didn't matter to me anymore. My part was done. I had reclaimed my life, my boundaries, and my peace. Her fall, like everything else, had been a mirror for her to see herself, and a final lesson for me in patience, restraint, and the subtle art of letting truth do its work. I realized, watching it unfold, that the most enduring forms of revenge aren't dramatic. They aren't loud, and they don't require violence or spectacle. They are quiet, patient, and unavoidable. They come in the form of living fully while others falter, in the cumulative weight of reality, in the slow and steady exposure of truth. Her facade crumbled, not because I tore it down, but because it could no longer stand on its own. And in that quiet collapse, I found closure, not in her defeat, but in my own liberation. Months had passed since the slow unraveling of her carefully constructed world began, and in that time, I had settled into a life I hadn't known I could live, steady, focused, and filled with quiet joys that had once been overshadowed by betrayal. The energy that had once gone into anger, doubt, and replaying every misstep she had made was now fully redirected toward myself, my growth, and the people who mattered. I had learned to fill the space she had left, not with resentment, but with meaning. And then, unexpectedly, the phone rang. Her voice was tentative, thin, almost fragile, like something worn at the edges and stretched too tightly over time. She asked to meet. There was no drama in her tone, no accusation, no demand, just a simple human request. I didn't hesitate. I knew that the meeting wouldn't be about proving anything, about demanding apology, or delivering judgment. That had already happened in the quiet ways life had unfolded around us. What I needed, what she seemed to need, was closure. A chance to mark the end of a chapter without spectacle or performance. I didn't bring notes, evidence, or reminders of past slights. I carried only myself, steady, composed, and fully aware of the person I had become. Confrontation is often imagined as a battleground, a place to triumph, to dominate, to inflict punishment. But the truth is that confrontation can also be quiet and restorative. It can be a moment where both parties see the reality of what happened, acknowledge the weight of choices, and leave without needing to escalate or justify. I had reached a place where I didn't need to triumph. I needed clarity, and I needed to release the power she once held over me. When she arrived, she was smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. The confidence she had once projected effortlessly was softened, fragile at the edges, and tinged with hesitation. There were no dramatic gestures, no sweeping apologies meant for effect. Her remorse was subtle, trembling at the edges of her words, imperfect, but real. She asked questions, tentative, probing, curious. How had I managed to move on so completely? Why hadn't I lashed out, retaliated, or publicly exposed her? She wanted to understand how I had escaped the orbit she once controlled so entirely. I looked at her and said simply, "Because my anger found better work." I rebuilt, and I invited people in who stayed. The words were calm, matter-of-fact, not a blow, but a statement of truth. I had chosen construction over destruction. I had chosen life over the drama she once thrived on. That choice had carried me far beyond the reach of her influence. And that was not something she could undo or challenge. It was a quiet kind of victory, invisible to the world, but undeniable to me. We spoke for hours. The conversation was not about rewriting the past or assigning blame, nor about convincing her of anything. It was about language, about articulation, about naming the experiences we had both endured and acknowledging what had been lost. I told her about the nights I spent replaying moments, hoping for a different outcome, about the way her betrayal had shifted the foundation of trust between us. She listened, truly listened, and in that listening was a subtle acknowledgement of the reality she had once refused to face. Her apologies came again, this time not for show or validation, but as tentative offerings toward real repair. I heard her, and I answered with honesty. I forgave her in the sense that I relinquished the power she had once wielded over me. Forgiveness, I explained, does not erase the past or remove consequences. It is a conscious decision to step out of the cycle, to reclaim oneself without holding the other in perpetual judgment. I could forgive and still maintain boundaries. I could release resentment while remembering the lessons it had taught me. She left with a quiet dignity I had not expected. It was not the dramatic flourish of a redeemed character or the triumphant appearance of someone having learned a lesson overnight. It was a subtle, fragile, human dignity. the kind that comes from confronting truth and walking away. Perhaps she would change. Perhaps she wouldn't. Change is not instant. It is not a single event. It is small, repeated acts over time, habits and choices that, gradually, reconstruct the person one hopes to become. That was hers to navigate, not mine to control. For me, that day marked the closing of a chapter I had carried for far too long. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't undo the pain, but it allowed the story to continue with clarity. I had reclaimed my narrative. I had restored my life. And in that reclamation, I found a profound sense of peace that no public spectacle, no dramatic revenge, and no validation from others could have offered. The confrontation that mattered was not loud or theatrical. It was composed, deliberate, and filled with the quiet power of presence, honesty, and self-possession. Walking away from that meeting, I realized that closure doesn't come from punishment, from forcing acknowledgement, or from watching the other person stumble. It comes from reaching a point where one is no longer dependent on their acknowledgement. It comes from understanding that peace is built internally, not externally, and that life moves forward when we allow it to. I left knowing that I had not only survived the betrayal, but transcended it. I had created a space where my growth mattered more than her remorse, where my life was untouchable by the mistakes and manipulations of the past. In the weeks and months that followed, I continued to cultivate the life I had claimed. Friendships, passions, routines, moments of laughter and quiet reflection. Her presence, once dominant in my world, became a faint echo, irrelevant to the rhythm I had restored. The confrontation, brief and understated as it was, had cemented the boundary I had fought to establish. I didn't need reminders. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I simply lived, fully and intentionally, beyond the reach of the past she had tried to control. By the time the memory of that conversation settled into place, I understood something important. True closure is not a theatrical ending. It is the steady reclamation of self, the quiet assertion of one's own life and choices. I had faced her, spoken truth, set limits, and walked away. That, more than any dramatic revelation or punitive act, was the confrontation that mattered. It was final, but not violent. It was firm, but not cruel. It was honest, and in that honesty, I found the freedom I had been waiting for all along. What I learned through all of this isn't the shallow lesson people often expect when they think of revenge. It's not a matter of sweetness or immediate gratification, nor is it about theatrics, confrontation, or public spectacle. The truth is far subtler, far more enduring. Revenge, the kind that matters, is about reclaiming your life in ways that leave the betrayer no choice but to see themselves clearly. It's about taking back your time, your energy, your attention, your sense of worth, and creating a life in which their actions can no longer define or diminish you. I didn't seek to destroy her life. I sought to rebuild my own, piece by piece, and to construct a space where I mattered to myself above all else. That, I realized, was the quiet, unassailable power that comes from measured, deliberate action. After it all unfolded, people asked me if I felt guilty, and the answer is complicated. There was a faint, inevitable sadness, not for having confronted betrayal, or for having enforced boundaries, but for witnessing someone I had once cared deeply for stumble through the consequences of their own choices. It was a sorrow tinged with compassion, because compassion does not vanish in the presence of firmness. Setting boundaries, maintaining limits, and standing up for yourself does not mean abandoning empathy or ceasing to care about someone. It simply means understanding that love and loyalty are not blank checks for mistreatment, that kindness does not require self-erasure, and that preserving your own dignity is not a betrayal of your values. I learned that compassion can exist alongside strength, that you can care and still protect yourself, and that the two are not mutually exclusive. The moral here is not that revenge is required, or that you must always retaliate. It is not a call to plot, to expose, or to engineer dramatic consequences. Sometimes the most effective, most powerful response is silence. Sometimes it is indifference. Sometimes it is walking away and refusing to participate in cycles that will not honor your presence. Yet there is undeniable power in active reclamation, in taking back what belongs to you after someone else has attempted to steal it. If you notice patterns of behavior that cause harm, take note, document them, let yourself see them clearly. Protect your time, protect your boundaries, and invest in yourself relentlessly. Being kind does not mean allowing others to exploit you. Being loyal does not mean surrendering your peace. True strength lies in defending your worth without poisoning yourself in the process, in reclaiming your energy without carrying unnecessary bitterness, and in living fully while refusing to let the misdeeds of others dictate the trajectory of your life. Looking back, I don't see a perfect ending. Life rarely gives neat cinematic resolutions. What I see instead is a real ending, messy, honest, and profoundly instructive. She learned in her own way that actions have consequences, that choices leave marks not only on others, but on oneself, and that charm and manipulation cannot withstand the steady scrutiny of patience and truth. I learned that patience, self-respect, and dignity hold more weight than melodrama, gossip, or fleeting victories. I learned that the person I had become, steady, self-aware, emotionally independent, was the true measure of my triumph. In reclaiming my life, I discovered how to care without losing myself, how to love without surrendering my boundaries, and how to thrive even in the aftermath of betrayal. If there is one lesson that stands out above all, it is this: when someone betrays you, the most powerful response is not to mirror them, not to succumb to pettiness, and not to act from anger. The truest power lies in living fully, authentically, and unapologetically in a life that demonstrates beyond any doubt that you were never small enough to be defined by their choices or limited by their actions. Let them dig the holes of their own making. Let them wrestle with the consequences of their behavior, and let them stumble through the absence of your validation. Above that, build. Build the life you want. Build a self that cannot be shaken by betrayal. Build joy, resilience, connections, and meaning that belongs solely to you. That is where true freedom resides. That is where the quiet, enduring victory lives. Living through and beyond betrayal taught me the power of resilience, of deliberate choices, and of integrity. Every small step I took to reclaim my time, strengthen my relationships, and pursue my passions was an act of quiet triumph. Every instance in which I refused to react out of spite, every moment I invested in myself instead of in anger, contributed to the creation of a life that no one could undermine. Watching my world slowly transform, my friendships deepen, my routines stabilize, my joy expand, revealed that revenge does not have to be destructive to be complete. It can be constructive, it can be enduring, and it can leave the betrayer to reckon with reality on their own. The freedom I found was not external. It wasn't in her discomfort or in social consequences that befell her. It was internal. It was in the knowledge that I had reclaimed my power, that I had established boundaries I would no longer compromise, and that I could move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. It was in the realization that the life I was building was unassailable because it was founded on authenticity, integrity, and self-respect. The true victory was seeing myself stand unshaken, unbent, and unapologetically present in a life that was mine and mine alone. In the end, the story isn't about her fall or her lessons. It isn't about punishment or retribution in the conventional sense. It is about the reclamation of self, the construction of a life that reflects worth, resilience, and dignity. It is about creating meaning that cannot be stolen, about letting the consequences of betrayal play out naturally while you build something enduring above them. Watching that life unfold, steady, purposeful, and joyful, is the truest kind of victory there is. It is quiet, invisible to those who do not pay attention, but utterly undeniable to the one who lives it. And in that, I found not only closure and peace, but a profound understanding of my own strength, my own boundaries, and the life I am determined to protect and cultivate, no matter what shadows the past might cast.